James. And we'll have some mic issues, but that's just how it goes.
James Goldstein, TELUS Institute. I was very encouraged to hear the practitioner stories this morning, and those efforts should certainly be applauded. Really excellent work. I wanted to, though, go back to a question that Vanessa Timmer raised just a moment ago about the pushback that Dave, I think, mentioned from the business community about what does this mean for the local economy and business development and so forth. And it raises an issue that is very much a headline conclusion in a paper that David Allaway and others wrote that was mentioned in the resources list that was circulated to the participants, which is about the deeper structural systemic issues that work against, if you will, sustainable consumption, and that it challenges the rational choice model, and it talks about these larger systemic political power and values issues. And so the question or comment I have relates to, are there limits to what cities, municipalities, even regions can do given these larger forces around culture, values, socioeconomic systems, and so forth? Is that, are cities an effective leverage point to address those? And one final quick comment. I hadn't heard David's last comment about, if I heard you right, the state of Oregon. And this is extremely encouraging to me, thinking about or adopting GPI, moving away from gross state product. That's at least a beginning to rethink these systemic value issues. So I hope that's clear.
So somebody want to weigh in on that item before we start something new?
So adding to your remark, James, I was wondering, these are all front-run cities, right? How does it diffuse to more mainstream cities or more backward cities, and what are the barriers there? Sorry, that could be part of this issue.
Yes, sir. So we're going to start trying to stay a little bit on this topic, and then Chef.
Right. So I just wanted to respond to your comment. I have Debbie Downer in front of me. I'm Dean Kubani with the City of Santa Monica, and I'm usually Dean Downer. I actually have felt this way for a long time, that we're swimming upstream and it's a really steep stream, and there's nothing that we can do as cities to really combat Coca-Cola and advertising and buy and all of that stuff. And it almost felt like all the stuff that we were doing is window dressing. But I have to say, this morning, after listening to these presentations, I feel much more hopeful and positive because, number one thing that I wasn't thinking about is this demographic shift in these millennials and the trends toward a more sharing economy. That's happening organically. And it feels like what our role as in cities needs to be is, rather than just throw up our hands and say there's nothing we can do, is to guide these trends. And I'm thinking already of like all the things that are happening in my community. We have a thing called Bike-Row-Wave, which is a bike repair place. And we've got our buy local economy, and we do citywide yard sales. And those, I always feel like those are kind of peripheral things and they're not really making that much of a difference, but actually they're energizing the community. So I think there really is something that cities can do, and probably what we shouldn't do is try and fight against the stream of all the the Walmart and the Coca-Cola and what's out there. That's all noise, but rather help to promote and strengthen these other types of things that are out there. And the last thing that I wanted to say, I'm president of a board of Co-Opportunity, which is a cooperative market. And I'm really starting to see that as And I guess this comes to that question of, cities and the economy, and if you're pushing a sharing economy, it's damaging economic development. Well, what we're trying to promote through co-opportunity and actually in our community is promote more businesses like that, which are, they're still commerce, they're still selling things, and there's consumption, but they're buying local from local farmers, from local producers, they're giving back to the community, so it's a different type of consumption. It still provides jobs, they actually provide better paying jobs. So it's kind of shifting the paradigm a little bit, and it's something that the local Chamber of Commerce really supports too.
So other voices on this topic, which generally is, are there limits to what municipalities can do, and what about the cities that aren't in the forefront? So let's go back here.
Hi, I'm Joe Zintek from the city of San Jose, and I think we're considered not quite in the forefront as Flagstaff or Portland or Eugene. But I think that what I'm really hoping to get out of this is kind of a one-pager that I can give to non-environmental people like Republican councilmen on our council. Just shows the value of doing this, reducing consumption. And I think with our city, as I talked about with some of you in California, the tax money that the city get is sales tax and the state gets the property tax. So our economic development office is very much all about citing big box retail in parts of our city, which of course hurts regular retail and makes mom and pops not be sustainable that sell the smaller retail outlets, and I think lowers our labor rate. So I'm hoping for a model where maybe we could look at taxing services, which is, I think, is more sustainable and kind of where we have to go than retail, but also there's a negative benefit to quality of life, I think, with big box retail being the sole focus. So that's kind of what I'm hoping to get out of this, is a way to sell this proposition to people that don't speak the language and don't know, haven't thought it through that much about the implication.
So in part, it's making the business case for the city, but it's also even looking at things like the tax structure, and is a transformation needed?
Not to belabor this point, Nils from USDN. Yeah, I think the scalability issue is huge, and that's something that within our network would be, we'd have a huge appetite for that, and we've heard a lot from the West Coast cities. So really to drill down, like, is there a toolkit that could be developed? Are there case studies or models where there's good examples of the public-private partnership working together on this that we could really highlight? Building that positive narrative around this, I think, is really important, to Joe and Dean's point. And yeah, this is a great area where I think our academic and our practitioner partners could work together on this. So a real rich area for that.
Excuse me. Hi, I'm Stephen Moore from the University of Texas at Austin, the Center for Sustainable Development. This idea of the distance between macro-scale structures and micro-scale activity in cities is actually the same topic that the academics talked about this morning, right? So Halina talked very nicely about reframing our collective sense of well-being, and Cindy talked about embedded economies. But of course, then Maurie came right back and seemed to smash the whole thing by talking about global structures. And there was no way that these two things could communicate with each other. What's finally kind of dawned on me this morning is that civil society groups constituted of municipalities, who are represented here, and universities, who are represented here, might actually begin to develop action-oriented researchable questions that could begin to work at both ends of this thing, both at the macro scale and at the micro scale. It seems to me that's an enormously exciting opportunity.
Am I missing somebody here? So we'll go over to Bill.
Thank you. Bill Rees from UBC. I often come to meetings looking for something more upbeat than I'm usually confronted with in my own work. And I'm glad to say that this has been one of those meetings. It's very rare. A couple of points. I think it's really important in our discussion with potential partners in all of this to distinguish between growth and development. Growth is just getting bigger, and you can get bigger and get worse at the same time. And for the most part, that's what we've been doing in North America for the last 30 or 40 years. The economy has grown in scale by all the conventional measures, but life quality for the average person has declined steadily through this entire period. So you can diffuse a lot of the antagonism around what we're doing here by showing people that we can get better, improve human well-being, safety, security, community, and all of those things with a much smaller scale economy. The happiest times in North America were in the 50s and 60s when per capita GDP was a fraction of what it is today. So we just have to dispel the notion, I know there's going to be some controversy around this, that there's a tight relationship between GDP and well-being. A couple of other points, and it's been raised indirectly by many of the presentations, and that is to what degree do state or even national policies interfere with what we need to be doing at the community level to make progress in these areas. For example, we've just entered in Canada into a European free trade agreement, and there's this Pan-Pacific free trade agreement, which will disallow local communities to favor local production and goods acquisition within their own domains. Now, to my mind, that's a completely antagonistic approach to what we're attempting here. And isn't it time for municipalities to rise up together through their associations to confront federal governments to negotiate agreements which favor transnational capital at the expense of local small business? For example, one way of improving the job opportunities in local municipalities is simply through import displacement. Why shouldn't Portland and Eugene be making their own shirts and shoes and so on and so forth? Small-scale manufacturing gives people a sense of pride in what they're doing. They may not make the big income, but at least they'll have a job, and they'll be creating local employment and so on and so forth. There are many, many things that need to be done at the local level to improve diversity at a smaller scale of consumption. It won't stop people from buying shirts and shoes, but they'll be buying them locally. The money will circulate within the community, and so on and so forth. I know you're getting impatient. I could go on like this for about 3.5 hours, so I won't bore you.
I've heard.
Wake up.
You gotta wake up. I'll come back to you in a minute, Neal.
Hi, John Stutz from TELUS. I have 3 comments, all of them, I think, coming from the earlier presentation by the practitioners. One has to do with the need to look closely at special communities to understand what you can do there. First step is to understand why they do what they do. I'll just share with you one example. I did a study many years ago looking at recycling rates in one town in Massachusetts. We did it by very small geographic areas. The recycling rates varied more than the recycling rates did by town over the entire state. So there was more variation in the one town. And it was absolutely impossible going in to understand exactly how the variation occurred or what was causing it. For example, we discovered that there was very low recycling in a very cohesive and group of people who are very proud of their homes and you would think would be very interested in recycling. We discovered that they thought that recycling containers were unsightly because they didn't have tops. Garbage cans have tops, so it was better to put out garbage than recycling. Nobody could have figured that out without talking to that community. So I really second the idea of looking very closely. The other thing that I wanted to say is that you can often convince people that they don't have to look at the immediate consequences of action when formulating public policy. And this is very important when you deal with businesses who say, well, we need the jobs, or we need the sales, or we need the sales tax revenue. There are examples all up and down the eastern seaboard where people vote for higher taxes to pay for schools. That's money out of their pocket, but they vote for it. They vote for it because they understand that it's in their long-term economic interest to live in a community that has a good school system. It's an example where the short-term answer is the wrong answer, and people show that by the way they vote. But you have to be willing to take on that fight to get those results.
Neal with Shareable. So the question is what is the limits to what cities can do in sustainable consumption? And one limit is a kind of narrative limit, which is that as long as cities aren't in control, either individual or collectively, of what a city is about, then there will be limits and to what can be done in sustainable consumption. And as I think Socrates said, is those who tell the stories control society. And so the dominant story about cities is told by multinational corporations. So it's the smart city, as an example. So I mean, one response that Shareable is kind of innovating and trying out is talking about cities as sharing cities. And you know, maybe that's not the right language, maybe there's other language, but it's moving away from understanding cities as marketplaces and technological wonders and efficiency machines for growth and expansion, to cities as places for people, and cities as commons.
Be right back. So,
Hi, thanks. My name is Rosemary Cooper. I'm with One Earth, and I'm coordinating a project on local governments in the sharing economy. And the whole idea behind that is sort of asking ourselves, how can cities get ahead of the curve and really harness the sharing economy in order to advance city priorities around sustainable consumption and other related sustainability goals? And I think there's two things that I've sort of heard from people is, one, there's not a lot of research and a lot of data out there about how the various areas of the sharing economy actually impact sustainability, whether it's durable social connections or, you know, real waste reduction and emission reductions. There's some by Susan Shaheen on traditional two-way car sharing. But the sharing economy has grown and moved so fast that the research isn't really there. And I would imagine if I'm sitting there in a local government, you know, am I going to get a bang for my buck if I get involved with enabling or supporting the sharing economy, and where should I focus? You know, in the transportation area, in food, in a Be Resourceful campaign. So I think there's a huge research gap there. And I think the other one goes back to what we've heard is, what is the appropriate role of local government? What can we learn from folks like Portland about where they've been effective and where they're sort of comfortable and getting a real leverage? So that's another one. I mean, once we understand where those, you know, what areas of the sharing economy really can contribute to sustainability and social connection, then what is the role of local government? I mean, how do they move forward?
we've got Tom, we've got, we've got Sue, April, and Christy and you. So since I'm right here, let's grab you. We'll do the trio if that's okay, and then Jason's got something he wants to share.
Thanks, Ashley Zanoli, West Coast Climate Forum, and just building off of the limitations for cities and their roles, but also the language that we're using and how we tell the story. One of my questions is, how can we shift the conversation to talking about citizens instead of consumers? I've been leading a lot of work on community food waste prevention, and we talk about consumers, and within the research and within some past events I've been to, I think there's a tremendous opportunity for citizen engagement, and we may be ourselves creating a lot of unintentional consequences in framing the conversation around consumer action versus citizen action.
Okay, let's get over to April.
Great points. Thank you all. April Rinney. I work also in the sharing economy at the intersection of public and private sectors. And just two comments. One, building on what Rosemary was saying, for people who are interested in developing a research agenda, I work with some companies in the sharing economy, helping them with their policy issues and also thinking about cities and cities' engagement more proactively, but then also work with local and sometimes national governments looking back into the sharing economy saying, what is this space? How is it all connected? Because I think it is important to recognize that here today, we are already, it's a wonderful group, I'm thrilled to be here, It is a very self-selecting community where there are hundreds, if not thousands, of cities around the world that have never heard this term before, much earlier on the learning curve. And so helping them figure that out. If we're interested, I'll just sort of throw this out there. I have a research agenda. I'm not a researcher. I'm not in academia. I have a research agenda of things that need to happen, also from the private sector perspective, from the community perspective, topics, issues, where those pain points are. If anyone wants to discuss further, I'd be more than happy to have that conversation. And then the second piece I want to just add, without throwing too much oil into the fire, if that's right, is that from a company perspective, we do need to keep in mind a lot of companies don't necessarily get into this for a sustainable consumption purpose. They get in, perhaps, and here I'm talking more on the for-profit side, to make money, to build community, to do lots of things. But I'll just talk about transportation in particular. It's one of the key areas where there's a lack of data. A lot of times people assume that ride-sharing companies are tracking this data. They're not. There's no, why would we spend limited resources to do that? So we need to keep that mindset in mind, as well as the fact, and I don't want to devolve into an Uber versus Lyft debate, but we also do need to just be really careful of which platforms are built with DNA that builds community. If you ask Uber, are you part of the sharing economy, they will say no. We are a communications company. We are a logistics company. We are an Amazon. We are not a community building company. And so for the public perception, it's still one of the most common examples of the sharing economy. But just keep in mind, if the company doesn't see themselves as in this way, we need to do a different kind of reframing, perhaps, which also then leads to other conversations around finance, funding, social mission, etc. Thanks.
Over here.
Great, thanks very much. I'm Christy Shelton with Cascadia Consulting Group. I'm sorry, like David, I've been sick and I'm kind of... Sorry, does that work better? Okay. I've been sick and I'm kind of losing my voice, so hopefully the mic will help. I'm Christy Shelton with Cascadia Consulting Group, and I've been working on a project supported by USDN with Babe O'Sullivan and Joe from San Jose and others who are here in the room that is related to this measurement and quantification of sustainable consumption activities. One of the pieces that I wanted to follow up on the One Earth comment and April's comment is around the significant data gaps in these fields and how cities are very challenged not only in how they prioritize and choose which impacts to focus on, but then once they do take on a program, how they can measure the progress of that program and whether it's indeed leading to measurable outcomes in terms of changes in local consumption. A lot of the patterns are tracked at larger scales nationally and such, and it's very difficult for a city to do its own data collection and analysis around these areas. Our project has specifically looked at work around the reuse, repair, and rental of what we're elegantly calling the stuff category, which is like household goods, clothing, etc. Also looking at transportation and ride sharing, and then looking at tool lending libraries. And in that, there's some very different ranges of data that are available in those areas, but we're kind of running into roadblocks again and again in terms of not having all the information that you need for really looking at the environmental impact, the social impact, the economic impact of these activities, and how you can measure change over time. So definitely a lot of data needs to add to the research agenda. But very excited about this workshop. Thanks.
Thank you. We're going to shift to Jason, and then I've seen Bill and Dean with hands up. There may be others, so we'll get back to you. Let's shift to Jason. Mike, want to make sure, one thing that we want to try to daylight in this workshop, we've heard that there's a need for more data, and that some folks already have ideas for the research agenda. So don't leave this workshop on Saturday without having put that stuff out there, because that's the whole point of getting together.
Is that on? Couldn't get it to work, so I'll just use that. So I just want to show a few slides. This is crude research. We would love to have an academic volunteer to help us to make this into better, more refined research, but I want to speak to why I have some anxiety about the enthusiasm for a sharing economy as a way to deal with the things that I've been working on for a long time, which is how consumption drives environmental impacts. And so it's a crude analysis. What this is showing is based on US GDP. That big gray box is household demand. So that's household consumption. The big blue box is government demand. The big gray box is about 10 trillion. The government box is about 2.5 trillion. So that's the consumption that we're talking about that's driving everything else. You add in export, another 2.5 trillion. So 15 trillion of demand, that's consumption. If we just look at the household piece, based on our analysis, 2/3 of it is service. More than 2/3 is services, and about 30% is goods. Of that, about 11% is durable goods. That's the shareable stuff, the stuff that we're talking about in the sharing economy. And if you convert that roughly to GHGs, the durable goods, the shareable part is 10% of the GHG, of demand-driven GHGs. 66% of demand-driven GHGs is services, and a big portion of that is energy and fuel. The others, there's a list of healthcare, housing, financial services, all the services that households buy. Food and beverage, of course, on the good side is a big chunk, but not shareable, nor are non-durable goods like clothing and other non-durable goods. So when we talk about a sustainable consumption, I would hope that, particularly from a city's perspective, cities would be thinking about that whole box and how cities can play a role in reducing levels of material consumption associated with all of that consumption, all of that household consumption, potentially through partnership with the large and small businesses that are in the business of providing those services to consumers, and how the partnerships with those entities could result in reductions in material intensity of that consumption. So I want to emphasize it's crude research. I don't want to treat these numbers as hard and fast, but I think in terms of size, it's probably a pretty good estimate of size and why the sharing, so that's the kind of Dean Downer 2, right, on sharing economy. The kind of upside, I think, is presented more on the community engagement side, and I think those of you who've heard Annie Leonard present recently as the kind of the most recent version of her Story of Stuff narrative, she acknowledges that, so she's a big promoter of the sharing economy, but not as a way to address environmental impacts, which is an area that she cares about a lot, but as a way to build what she calls the citizen muscle. She has a nice little picture of this, which is weak. Our consumer muscle is strong right now, and that the sharing economy is a great way to build citizen muscle, potentially municipal muscle, potentially state muscle, that can then build the muscles to deal with the federal kind of perverse incentives and perverse regulatory regimes within which cities and states are forced to work. So just putting in context, from a perspective of somebody like me who's thinking about where are the leverage points for environmental impacts, sharing economy is not, that sharing of the cars and the lawnmowers and stuff is not going to make a difference for the environment, big picture, but it might build some citizen muscle, and I'm very much with Annie Leonard on that.
So I saw Maurie doing this. Okay, Bill and Dean, and back to Rosemary, and then let's check where we are to go back to the group.
Thank you, Bill Rees again. This really builds on Jason's comment. When we talk about sharing, mostly we've been talking about sharing consumption, but we really ought to be talking about sharing production. And just as an exercise, would invite you all to do a brief online study of something called the Mondragon Cooperatives in Spain. M-O-N-D-R-A-G-O-N. This was a group of cooperatives that formed after the Second World War, but really pulled much of Spain, the northern Basque region in particular, up by the bootstraps. It was organized around a very simple principle, that all production and consumption should be owned by the people who are actually doing it, so that the most successful businesses in Spain for many decades were owned by the Mondragon cooperatives. Each person who belonged to a manufacturing sector, such as they did cookers and washing machines and that sort of thing, had to have an equal share in the company. They had to rotate through the board of directors. The highest paid officer in the company received only 4 to 5 times the salary of the lowest paid shop floor worker, so it was a great equalizer. And I could go on. The last time I looked, just a couple of years ago, when the Spanish economy was in free fall, there was no unemployment, And no one left out in the Mondragon area. In other words, everybody was still employed. It was still the most successful part of the Spanish economy. Now, it's based on a principle that most of us in North America would cringe on, called equity. Some would call it socialism and all the rest of it. The fact of the matter is it works, and it works extremely well. It began to break down when Spain was forced into the European community, when they had to privatize even Medicare, because a part of the Spanish law is that no private owner of capital can join the state Medicare system. So they created their own cooperative hospitals. Worked really well, except no doctor would work for them unless the minimum salary, maximum salary ratio was raised to 7 or 10 to 1, something like that. But the point is, this is a model for worker and consumer cooperatives, both in manufacturing and in retail, that has proved enormously successful in maintaining equity and in maintaining income and employment and social coherence in that region of Spain. It should be a model that the world looks at more carefully. There's a wonderful BBC film on the whole success of the story, should you ever choose to look at it. But for the most part, it's been suppressed by mainstreamers who don't want this kind of model out there and well known. Mondragon Cooperative, lots of good stuff online, many good books describing how it works.
Dean, Rosemary, and then let's catch Babe. And
Great. Just a quick thought that was popped into my head based on some of the other comments, and also Bill's comment about the need for cities to rise up. And I just thought of, we've demonstrated as cities that we have risen up, and as we've joined together. For instance, we've really been making some success and headway swimming up this steep stream on producer responsibility, particularly in California. There's been a lot of good work there, pushing back on big pharma and getting them to take back drugs. We've just had a lot of local plastic bag bans like San Jose and Santa Monica, and on the success of those, we just got a statewide plastic bag ban passed in California. So I bring these up as, these are kind of small peripheral issues, but it really shows the power of cities joining together, and I think I'm just wanting to put on the table for future discussion about what are the key things that we as cities should be looking at to work on collectively, right? In Portland, we've got, all these great programs about sharing economy, and we're doing these things individually in our own communities, but collectively, what should we as cities be looking at to work on as a group?
so for instance, even how are these kinds of conversations influencing U.S. Conference of Mayors or National League of Cities or other organizations? So that might be. So we had Rosemary, Babe, and then we'll come back to you, Halina.
I'm going to follow through on Jason's slide, which unfortunately I couldn't totally see clearly. But first of all, I loved what you had to say about that the sharing economy is a great way to build citizen muscle. I mean,
That's Andy Leonard. I'm just quoting.
yeah, but I just a nice reminder that, and to my right here, that we're not just consumers, we're citizens, we're people. So one of the things I wanted to say is that I think when we think about the sharing economy, we have to think about what's in it. So, I mean, I think we automatically think about the recirculation. We think about consumable products, the recirculation of goods, and the using durable goods more efficiently or extending their life. But there's also a chunk of the sharing economy which is about services, and another chunk that's about co-production. So I was kind of curious I couldn't actually read some of the slides, but I was kind of curious to know what was in that services chunk, because I'd be curious to know whether there are actually sharing economy entities that are in that space.
What would you say is an example of an area of the sharing economy that pertains to services?
Well, pardon me? Yeah, time. On the non-monetized side, there are time banks, which are significant, and on the sort of more corporate monetized side, something like TaskRabbit. And so one example, I'm sure April has many other examples in her head. In the co-production space is everything from co-working spaces to maker labs, which I just had a great tour of the other day, to industrial symbiosis. So I think it's, part of our, people are really struggling with defining the sharing economy. I just read a paper by Juliet Shore that says, it's extremely difficult to, and everybody's got different categories. April Rennie in a report, a Nesta report, contributed to a report coming out of the UK that said, you know, we see 5 key traits that define what's in the sharing economy. So.
We'll come back. Babe, Halina, and then let's check in with the notes and come back to the group.
Well, I just wanted to drill down on Jason's slides for a minute because I saw he chatted with me back in December of last year about the same topic, and it's raised the same level of interest for me because if in fact services are where the action is, I want to reflect that in the work that we're doing locally in our climate action planning and in the policies and programs we're bringing forward to our city council. So I'm going to call upon a couple of people to be thinking about this. I'd like to understand better how Jason's analysis aligns with or departs from the EPA analysis of 2009 by Josh Stolaroff that really set us running on this whole conversation about the relationship between greenhouse gases and consumption. How did that EPA analysis account for services? Because typically it's mentioned as foods and goods.
Yeah, so the EPA analysis for all the great things it did was not a consumption frame. It was not the U.S.'s consumption-based emissions. It was our domestic in-boundary emissions. And so all the service organizations that are the lawyers that are sitting in buildings that are using heating and lighting, that showed up in the building sector. And all the taxis driving around and the airplanes flying around was in the transportation sector. So services were given the same ill treatment by the Stolaroff pie chart as materials have been given the ill treatment by the conventional pie chart. It was not organized to answer questions around services. It was organized by a program within EPA that wanted to call out the importance of materials. So, how did this Oregon see So our consumption-based emissions inventory for Oregon breaks Oregon's consumption-based emissions into 4 broad categories: electricity, fuels, materials, and services. In our frame, and in here, you know, really energy is a service, but we broke it out separately so that we have electricity, fuels, and then all the other services, you know, massages and haircuts and tax consultants and all that sort of stuff. And services in that frame are significant. They're bigger than energy, they're bigger than electricity, and they're bigger than fuels. But the important thing to remember with services, I want to bring this back to the rebound effect, is emissions intensities. In the state of Oregon, the emissions intensity, the emissions per dollar spent for electricity and fuels are in the range of 4 to 7 kilograms of carbon dioxide per dollar spent. The emissions intensity for materials is about half on average. You know, rice and beef are different, but on average, for materials, half a kilogram of carbon dioxide per dollar spent. And the average emissions intensity for services, on average, is about 0.15 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per dollar spent. So while services are a large part of the economy, and they are a significant part of our consumption-based emissions, they are the lowest, they have the lowest emissions intensity. So if we're going to try in some way or another to redirect money in terms of where the money is flowing, consumption of services, with the exception of airline travel and waste collection service, generally speaking, services have the lowest emissions intensity, and that bears, you know, that's consistent with what we all say, you know, at the holidays, you know, give gifts of experiences as opposed to stuff, etc. As long as you don't have to drive someplace to experience that gift of, you know.
So we've got Halina and Maurie, and what I'm hearing, I think you probably have captured it, Mike, is that part of the work will be achieving a common understanding of what we mean by what we say, what the different segments of the economy are, and what does sharing economy mean. So even understand that. So Halina and then Maurie.
If you allow me, I'd like to make 2 short comments, right? So one thing is I'd like to stress the complexity, systemic nature of problems that we may want to address. Take, for example, wanting people move to smaller houses, choose smaller houses. David Allaway told a good story that at the particular moment in time when builders had no jobs, they were willing to build smaller houses. I wonder if it will last. But generally, okay, if you want people to choose smaller houses, you have to look at a variety of things, right? So culturally, for example, we think of a house as an investment, not as a home in many cases, right? So when you buy a house, you think right away, am I going to profit from it X number of years down the road when I sell this house? Right? At which point the real estate agent whispers into your ear that you will do much better on that score when you have a house with 4 bathrooms instead of a house with 2 bathrooms. And the developers are happy to oblige with that, right? And the banks have a policy of when they lend for mortgages that the bigger the house, the more likely they're going to give you the money because they see good returns on their investment. So you can see it's cultural, it's fiscal policies, it's the builders, it's institutions and the rules and us, right? So if we want people to choose smaller houses, we have to think about it as a system, right? So that's one comment. The one shorter, I promise, is about sharing economy. I hear a lot about it in this conversation. Juliet Shore gave a talk at our colloquium on social change about sharing economy, right? And she's funny, somebody actually did some research on it, right? And the results were very sobering. So even if we conclude that ecologically speaking, sharing economy may be not saving that much energy, but we will say it's still good because it builds citizens' muscle or something. I mean, it's very good if it has social impacts. But what Julie's work showed was that in these time banks, in these food swaps, the economic, social, racial divisions were perfectly reproduced. Right? So it's not a community builder, really, right? People go into time bank, and the financial advisor, who presumably should give an hour of high-value financial advice into the pool, offers his amateurish carpentry skills, right, into the pool, because says, this is too valuable. I'm not going to share it with the babysitter down the street. All right? We are reproducing the same, the same divisions that we have in the society as a whole. I'm not saying that I know how to fix it. I just don't want us to think that this is some kind of remedy to everything and a great community builder. If we build great communities and from it sharing practices emerge, maybe we'll have something. But let's not expect the sharing economy to solve our social division.
Let's go to Maurie, and then if you're someone else with your hand up, just remember you had your hand up, and I'll ask you again to raise them.
Well, Halina just, took away most of the point I wanted to make, so I don't need to trace over that ground again, but I did just want to follow up on some of this discussion that David was echoing about services versus material goods. I think we get ourselves into a lot of problems when we sort of develop this siloized conversation about services on one hand and material goods on the other. That we need to recognize that we need to recognize that we shouldn't fall into this reductionistic trap, that consumption takes place in a system, and that services are built on material platforms, and material platforms are tightly interconnected with services. So if we think about education as the quintessential or a quintessential service, that the reason that most people pursue education is in order to raise their income so that they can then consume more. That even when you hire a babysitter, again, another quintessential service, to take care of your children on Saturday night so you can go out for a night out, you are then engaging in material forms of consumption. So it's not a question of services versus material goods, but a recognition that they're tightly connected, and that that one, in fact, enables the other. So just finish on that point.
Thank you. Let's visit the notes